Hi, welcome to my presentation on New York State hospital-acquired infection rates 2008 through 2013. This presentation will discuss the New York State HAI dataset and the intended purpose of my visualization, which is to provide healthcare professionals tools they can use to explore data about infections in acute care hospitals in their community and across the state and assist in scholarly inquiry. HAIs are infections acquired as the result of treatment in a hospital, and they represent significant causes of morbidity and mortality and are very costly to hospitals, up to $45 billion annually. They're important to measure in order to find connections between medical practices and outcomes and to identify best practices and faulty procedures. This data visualization can help hospitals assess their own performance, compare it to others and state averages, to improve quality of care, prevent future infections, and to raise professional and public awareness, and to argue for policy changes and funding increases. More on the purpose of this project. This data set is large and complex and was pretty difficult to work with for a layperson. It really requires knowledge of medical terminology and hospital practices, infections, and even statistical analysis. It also required some caution in drawing inferences, because this data set does not tell a single overarching story. It's also limited in terms of infections and procedures. It doesn't tell us more about each hospital or the population served. So this really invites the expertise of New York State healthcare professionals to bring that to this data. So this visualization was conceived as what Elmquist et al. Referred to as a dialogue with the data, as interactive tools that medical professionals can use to filter and display data, to assess their performance, to improve practice, to inspire research and scholarship, and perhaps most importantly, to create information products for administrators and consumers alike. Now, a bit about this HAI data. New York State Public Health Law 2819 was signed in 2005, so this is a relatively recent initiative. It requires all acute care hospitals to report infections, and 2008 was the first year this was all published. By 2013, 170 hospitals were participating. And it's a growing data set. For example, CDI indicators, which we'll talk more about in a moment, were added in 2010. And it comes with a great deal of documentation. It's very helpful in understanding this data. Now we need to keep a few things in mind. The hospitals report indicators based on the procedures they perform, which do differ from facility to facility. But this doesn't come with any data about hospital size, no population-specific information. So external factors, as I mentioned, do need to be taken into account. Also, each HAI has its own definition and measure, which make comparisons and interpretations difficult, at the very least requiring some caution. Now, just a few words about the data elements. For such a large data set, this had relatively few elements. I didn't use all of them in this visualization. The most important ones were hospital name, the location, which was represented as latitude and longitude. And I will mention that the data set arrived with that in one column with lat and long, comma separated in parentheses, which Tableau cannot read. So there was a bit of work to separate the two data values into two separate columns, but then Tableau was able to visualize that. And then we have indicator names, which are three different kinds of infections. We'll talk more about how they're subcategorized and measured in a moment. Then there's infections observed and predicted, and then indicator units which compute an average of those figures. And then most importantly, comparison results, which determines a particular hospital's performance against state averages. Now, the first HAI indicator is CLABSI, which in medical parlance is called central line infection. These are associated with intensive care units and procedures performed there. Now, the central line is a tube that's placed into a large vein. It's used to give fluids and medications, withdraw blood, monitor the patient's condition. But it's very susceptible to microorganisms like bacteria and fungus that can travel around in the tube and then enter the blood and cause infections. Now, attention to CLABSIs reflects changes in medical care within our lifetimes. Up until the 1990s, central lines were just sort of placed and left in place for the duration of the patient's stay, but it was found that these kinds of infections resulted from it. So surveillance is extremely important. Changing the lines is extremely important. There are 10 CLABSI indicators, such as coronary and pediatric ICUs. There's an overall standard ratio which averages each facility's total CLABSIs. And the denominator, that is the lower part of a fraction used to calculate a rate or ratio, is determined by the number of days a central line is placed for each patient in ICU. The second HAI is the surgical site infection, which refers to specific elective surgeries. These are postoperative infections right where the surgery took place. There are 5 SSIs, like colon and hip, and then one of the SSIs, the coronary artery bypass graft, is further subdivided into chest site and donor site. The donor is where the vein or artery is taken from the leg or the arm for heart surgery. Now, this particular HAI is measured by number of procedures, which represents a clear relationship between the surgery and the infection. But as we can see, SSIs are measured differently than CLABSIs, which makes comparison between the two difficult. The third HAI is CDI, which is Clostridium difficile, or C. diff for short. This is a bacteria which has some pretty nasty effects. It can result in diarrhea, even fatal colitis. The elderly and those on antibiotics are most susceptible to this particular kind of infection. Now, this particular measure is time-based, using the number of days the patient is at risk to determine whether this infection happened definitely while they were in the hospital, or definitely before they came into hospital care, or possibly sometime in there. So this basically gives 3 different figures, which are percentages of a whole. Now, I want to mention a few things about how this project came together. The documentation that came with the data set was extremely important. There was a data dictionary which explained all of these terms. There were reports, and perhaps most importantly, research questions, like are HAI rates decreasing over time, about hospital performance against state averages, and the relationship between CDI rates. And that helped me form these visualizations. My work with Tableau, learning it, was really a trial and error process. I took this data set through various tutorial exercises just to get to know it. And truly, learning to use Tableau was inextricably linked with my gaining knowledge of this data set. So I want to give you a quick tour of the visualizations here. My hope was that they would use this tool to ask questions of data, or ask questions that the data itself couldn't answer, such as why HAI rates are rising and falling. So the first visualization here uses a map and a chart of New York State acute care facilities and indicators of infections, and an indicator and denominator chart. This enables analysis of a particular hospital's performance over time following specific indicators. And it tries to show the relationship between an HAI rate and the denominator for each hospital. Now, for example, I've got this set up so we're looking at one particular hospital in Western New York, Highland Hospital. And I've got it set just to look at hip infections here. And we can see between 2008 and 2013 there were 34 hip infections shown. If we go down then to the chart, we can see that in that span of time they performed over 4,000 hip procedures to 34 infections. Now we could query this any number of ways. We can sort of reduce it and just sort of look at 2013. And we can see, it's not cooperating with me right now. Thanks, Tableau. Regardless, the The visualization can be queried by year. We can query any number of hospitals here and any number of indicators, but this tool really works best when we look at one hospital and one indicator and really sort of pinpoint it on the map like this. So some of the best practices that came to light from working with this visualization here was to, first of all, this style of filtering is used across all visualizations. So that lent a consistency, and I think that's important. But more important, probably more importantly than that, I think a practice that came out of this was the need to provide adequate user instruction. I tried to do so in each of the filter names, but I could see from doing this ways in which this might not be fully intuitive. And I can see that a best practice would be to provide some on-screen instruction briefly. The second visualization uses a line graph and a text table to look at HAI's predicted and observed and indicator units. And once again, I have this set up to study Highland Hospital. And what happens here is we look at these two measures, infections observed and infections predicted, and we can see some of the movements for Highland Hospital over the years here. And our text table here lets us study some of the related numbers behind the rises and falls on this chart here. Now, once again, we can query any number of hospitals here and indicator units. But some of the best practices that came out of working with this was one, to anticipate user needs, to find any possible shortcomings in a visualization. See, as presented, if more than one hospital is selected, it gets displayed as separate entries in the table, but the graph, as I've built it, only shows the two lines averaging the two facilities, which in retrospect is not the most helpful. A best practice in this case then would be perhaps to populate the graph with uniquely colored lines for each facility, because a user may well want to use it that way. The second thing I want to point out as a best practice is this null value here, which I chose to leave in but not select, but have it apparent. I place some trust in the integrity of the data set here, and many of these null values were due to the fact that in each year the data set grew. I think that a best practice that would come out of a project like this is that information professionals should collaborate with medical professionals to identify those null values, to see what they are, if they are of value or truly points of error. The third visualization here uses a bar chart to compare HAI indicators to New York State averages. This allows a user to identify when and where a hospital performs better or worse than the mean. And this could provide specific areas to investigate. So this filters by hospital name, comparison results, and indicator name. And what I've set up here, I'm showing some hometown pride here. I've got hospitals in Western New York where I grew up: Highland, Rochester General, Strong Memorial, and Unity. And we can see areas here where their performance, if we go down and take a look at our indicator units here that are by color, and we can see that Strong Memorial Hospital in several of these years had significantly higher than state average numbers for specific procedures or contexts. And rather than making judgments, because there could be a whole story behind all of this, this is where inquiry could begin. This was, out of all the visualizations, the most difficult one to construct. It required going back through the spreadsheets to identify certain problems in the data or in my understanding of the data. A best practice then would be to query the data set to see if the visualization makes sense. In earlier versions, I was getting multiple answers for each year, and it wasn't until studying the data set very closely that I managed to work that out. So that sort of sense-making aspect is definitely a best practice. The fourth visualization is a pie chart showing CDI relationships. That's in pursuit of one of the state's research questions. And again, I have it set on Highland Hospital here, and we could see using the tooltip feature that we can study changing numbers for each of the three CDI indicators here. And we can see that the largest area of uncertainty is, or the largest number here is where they are uncertain, where these infections began. And again, this allows us to sort of trace year by year and see if this one actually works. Yes. So we get slight changes here. We can query it and take a look at 2012 and mark slight changes in the results. Now, the best practice here, as I mentioned, was using using the filter name here. Though a user could choose multiple facilities, this pie chart tells the clearest story when its results are filtered by one institution. So unlike previous ones, I specified to just select one here. And I think that adding that kind of instruction is definitely a best practice. Okay, the last visualization that I explored here was an area chart. And this gives all HII rates observed over time. And we can see here, this sort of plays in with the line graph, which tells us that that huge jump that happened in 2010 wasn't because of some infectious disease outbreak in New York State, but because the CDI indicators were added. And what I like most about this particular view here is the tooltip feature really allows a user to trace over time. Now I've presented here with all infections shown, but we could specify it and take a look at some results here. Let's just look at the coronary artery bypass graft, and we can see very dramatically here that the state is doing seemingly quite well in limiting infections in both chest site and donor. So that's it. So a few key takeaways from this that I got. Now, Tableau requires the user to know the meanings and limitations of their data set, which is where the data dictionary and other resources that the Department of Health supplied really helped me as the visualizer learn the data set while learning Tableau. So the data documentation was sort of key to all of this. But I would also mention that the responsibility of data visualization creators to always sort of test and query their work to make sure that their visualizations are meaningful and accurate and don't misuse the data in any way. Above all, I found that this project really started to come together more for me when I focused on who my users were and what their needs were. And in the end, I thought that if this visualization was at all successful, it would be if it helped a hospital administrator assess their performance, that a scholar could use it to illustrate an article for publication, to add persuasive visuals to policy reports, or even create easy to understand graphics for consumer health bulletins. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your responses.